Hello, my friends and my family. Thank you for joining me on my new series, Asylum Sundays. I'm your host, Elle. Today's case is about the famous Nellie Bly. I was really struggling on doing this video first because I have patient files that are not known to the public, but I feel like this is a great introduction and insight into the world of asylums and gives the overall atmosphere so we can kind of ease into this together. My chair is squeaky, I'm sorry. I'm not getting a new one. So let's get into it. Nellie Bly was born as Elizabeth Jane Cochran Seaman on May 5th, 1864, making her a Taurus. Her family lived a lavish life. Her father owned the mill, was an associate justice, a landowner, and the postmaster in, you guessed it, Cochran Mills, Pennsylvania. That's how influential they were. She had a bunch of siblings, but I couldn't really find the actual number. Different reports had different accounts of how many kids, so we'll just say she has a lot of siblings. At 6 years old, her father passed away, and her mother, Mary Jane, could no longer afford to maintain the family business, so they had to move. Her mother later married, but ended up divorcing him because he was abusive. And, she's a strong, independent woman. She don't need no man. The family was in financial crisis for many years afterwards while Elizabeth was still attending school. And by the age of 16, unfortunately, the family funds had run out and Elizabeth was no longer able to afford her education. With no way to support themselves, her mother, and some of the siblings moved to Pittsburgh with their extended family. After the move, Elizabeth read an article titled, "What Girls Are Good For" by columnist Aramus Wilson, I'm not sure if I said that right, with the Pittsburgh Dispatch. In this article, he bashed women and stated that they were only good around the house and to bear children. The article was criticizing women who worked outside of the home, acting as if they were doing work outside the home to purposely insult men. He even suggested that we take a page from China's book and kill the female babies. Seriously, look him up. It really pissed me off. He sucks. After everything her family had gone through, and her mother having to work to support the family the best that they could, this really rubbed her the wrong way. Which, yeah, it also pissed me off when I read it. Seriously, this guy sucks. She decided she would write a rebuttal to the article under the name Lonely Orphan Girl. And the editor not only read it, but he posted her response and an ad asking her to come forward and say who she was. He was so impressed with her writing, and so she did. She came forward and was offered a job as a columnist. This is around the time when she wrote the article The Girl Puzzle, which is about women overcoming divorce. As a new writer and a female, Elizabeth changed her name and went under the pen name Nellie Bly, which was after a song by Stephen Foster, and it was a popular song at the time. Nellie was with a Y, however, due to an editor error, this was changed to an IE at the end. Being a journalist at the time was already hard enough, but being a female was much more difficult. And now her pen name was feminine instead of what would be considered, a neutral or even masculine printed name with the Y. So from this point forward, I will refer to Elizabeth Jane Cochran Seaman as Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly loved being a writer. However, the Pittsburgh Dispatch, they only offered her to write along the lines of fashion or home decor in the women's column. And Nellie just wanted to do more, in-depth kind of articles pertaining to all people, not just women. So she decided to move to New York City and pursue her passions. In 1887, finding work in New York proved to be hard for the female writer. She mentions this in her work Among the Mad. "We have more women now than we want," was the inevitable reply of editors to her plea for work. While some added, "Women are no good anyway." At this time, women had no status, especially in journalism, and Victorian ideals was that it was a woman's job to maintain the home and be what was considered an angel of the house, which meant that a woman was supposed to keep the home a sanctuary for men who had to endure the dangers of working in the world. Despite this social standard, Nellie pressed on. She spent 4 months just looking for work to no avail. She was mugged in New York City, and the last of her pennies were robbed from her. Nellie actually had to borrow money from her landlord to catch a cab to seek out Colonel Cockrell, the managing editor of New York World. She hustled her way past reception. She even got him to give her a $25 retainer so that she didn't seek out other press with her great investigative journalism ideas. For her first assignment, he asked her, "Do you think you can work your way into an asylum?" She believed that she could attempt, and even possibly succeed, in fooling all of the clever expert doctors. She was willing to give it a shot. The goal ahead was to spend 1 week in an asylum. She used $20 of the retainer to hold over her room and board and wrote all of her friends and family, asking them not to send her letters until she reached out to them, as she was going on a week-long assignment. This had to remain a secret so they would have less of an exposure risk, and with a heavy heart, she sealed and sent these letters. The assignment was stated as such: write up things as you see them, good or bad, praise or blame as you think just. Tell nothing but the truth. Nellie was nervous that she would not persuade the doctors of her insanity, so she practiced looking like crazy and wily-eyed in the mirror before she went to bed. The next morning, she embraced all of her natural routine. She enjoyed all the little luxuries because she had no idea what it was going to be like there. She didn't know if she was going to be able to brush her teeth or take a shower, so she just really absorbed all of the privilege as much as she could. Nellie had to find a way to get committed to the asylum, so she decided to go to the temporary house for women in New York. She used the name Nellie Brown, which was close enough to her pen name so that she could be found. Boarding houses for working women were a common place where single, unmarried, or widowed women, sometimes along with their children, would go to stay if they had to work to make a living. They would basically stay and have lower cost bed and breakfast type accommodations. When Nellie got to the boarding house, she was not impressed with the conditions. It was greasy, low lit, and desolate looking. So she was planning to make herself look crazy like as soon as possible to get out of that place. But she was not prepared for what was to come. Nellie had been accepted into the workhouse on the terms that she shared a room with another woman, since the house was so overcrowded. Over the course of a night, she was stating bizarre comments such as, "Everything is so sad. I do not know. It's all so sad. I never worked. I do not know." When referring to the other women in the house, she would say things like, "They look horrible to me, just like crazy women. I'm so afraid of them." The house assistant even agreed that the women of the house don't look very nice, but reassured her that they're like good, honest, working women, and they don't house crazy people there. She mentioned several times that the women of the house looked crazy, but they were all really slow to catch on, probably because they were like raggedy looking. So Nellie was boarded with the only woman who would bunk with her by the end of the night, which was a seriously kind and loving person and really tried to help Nellie. Like, bless that woman. All the women were growing increasingly uncomfortable with Nellie, whispering that she was crazy and she shouldn't be there. One even had a nightmare where she said that Nellie had been in her dream with a knife in her hand, trying to kill her, and she was able to scream and wake up. Like, how fucking bored were these women? Like, they have to be so bored if they go all batshit over a chick who just is a little bit weird or whatever. But anyway, Nellie stayed awake sitting at the edge of the bed all night, and her roommate was surprised to see her still awake in the morning, which was actually quite a struggle for her because she was so exhausted. With everyone in the house growing weary of her, the management had no choice but to calm everyone's fears by bringing the policeman to the home to get Nellie. The police told the management that if she didn't come quietly, they would literally drag her through the frickin' streets. Like, they did not care. Nellie told police that she had lost her trunks, as in like luggage, and she just wanted to find them. They acted as though they were going to help her find these lost trunks or her lost luggage, and they brought her to the courthouse. They reassured her that she would find her trunks and that everyone there was looking for lost trunks too. And she replied, they all seem to be foreigners too. Nellie was brought before Judge Duffy. The judge took pity on Nellie as she resembled his dead sister and requested they be kind to her, that there had to be someone, somewhere looking for this lovely little lady. When Judge Duffy asked her what was wrong, she replied, "Nothing is wrong except that I've lost my trunks, and this man promised to bring me where they could be found." For whatever reason, they believed she had been, like, drugged, and the judge believed her to be from Cuba, so she just kind of like rolled with that. The ambulance surgeon was the first to evaluate her. While trying to examine her, she refused to cooperate, and he told her she needs to let him conduct this evaluation because she's sick. Nellie was like, "Dude, I'm not sick and never was. I'm simply trying to find my luggage here." Nellie was then transferred by ambulance to Bellevue Hospital. Bellevue Hospital is a place that will be mentioned in a lot of my patient files as well, so I'll be covering that more in depth later on. But this earlier description of how they operated during her stay is really interesting. Once inside the medical pavilion at Bellevue, Bly was once again asked a ton of questions, but she refused to answer them. This time, the doctor said it's not even necessary. He had all the papers made out, and she was too insane to tell anything otherwise. Immediately afterwards, an orderly came up to her and grabbed her so tight by the arm that she felt like a pain run through her whole body. She got so angry, she forgot that she was acting insane and turned to him and was like, "How dare you?" This wing of Bellevue Hospital is known as the Pavilion for the Insane, and this was a wing that held many helpless women, mostly immigrants, some of which who were just homeless or straight up poor, with no history of mental illness. During her short stay at the Pavilion for the Insane, Nellie met and interacted with multiple women who she kind of was using to investigate. One of these women was Anne Neville. Anne had been diagnosed as overworked, and in these days, women who suffered fatigue and just didn't really have the financial means for support, they were basically institutionalized, which was exactly the case here. Anne had been working as a chambermaid and become overworked. She was basically just at a breaking point. She was immediately sent to what was called Sister's Home to be treated, but when her nephew could not pick up her housing bill anymore, she was sent to live as an insane woman in the walls of the Pavilion. Nellie asked her, what's the deal here? You seem sane. Why are you here? You know this place is for people, right? Anne told Nellie she tried to tell the doctors that she was sane, but they refused to listen to her, which really seems to be a trend in all of the cases that I've read about the insane asylums of New York City so far, which is a lot. Another patient, Miss Fox, was pretty much asked the same types of questions by Nellie, but she basically just said that her case was hopeless, and she shut down and just refused to answer anything further. One of the nurses threatened that she would not be gentle on Nellie if she didn't take off her hat. She had one orderly ask her for money. If she had money on her, give it to her because she can't spend it anyway. What the f are they doing? The food was awful, and she said that she couldn't even stomach it. She decided on just eating a cracker and some milk, even though she was starving. She hadn't eaten all day, all night. She stayed up all night, she's starving. She said all of the windows in the hall were open, and this is September in New York. It's freaking cold. She was freezing. She saw that all the other women were also shivering and miserable, so she complained, only to be told that in a place of charity, you're not to expect much else. When she finally bothered a nurse enough, she was given a nasty old shawl, and when she mentioned the condition of the shawl, the lady was shaking the bugs out of it and told her, people on charity should not expect anything and should not complain. Then it was time to see another doctor to be evaluated once again. Nellie, all dressed in her moth-eaten, nasty-ass shawl, was asked some weird and offensive questions this time. The doctor mentioned that she looked familiar, or that he knew her. It was all just really strange wording meant to kind of throw her off or get her to agree so he could be like, "Oh, you're crazy." However, she just kind of responded "What are you talking about, dude?" She was asked if she was a prostitute, what drugs she was on, etc. By the end of the questioning, he stated that she was positively demented and considered her to be a hopeless case who needs to go where someone will take care of her. The only insanity in this is the fact that a woman who has only complained of her missing luggage, didn't like being in freezing cold conditions, and didn't trust strangers in a workhouse, stayed up for one whole night, was called positively demented, and was being sent away for the rest of her life and seen as someone who was completely unable to care for herself. This is even after Judge Duffy was convinced she had been drugged by someone and that she was actually a lovely girl, just like his sister. The plan was supposed to be that she would dry up from whatever drug was fed to her until she could remember her life or until someone could claim her. But it turned into her being considered a lost cause within one day. After passing as insane on her second medical exam at Bellevue, she began to have a smaller regard for the ability of doctors more than ever. She was sure that no doctor could tell whether people were insane or not, so long as the case wasn't violent. The next morning, Nellie was examined again, and then again, and the doctors once again said that they knew her or she looked familiar. They also asked her this time if she had seen faces on the walls or if she heard any voices. She had overheard some of the other women being asked some of the same exact questions, to which they all answered they did not see faces on the walls and they did not hear voices. Yet as far as we know from her book, none of them were ever released. In fact, some of them even boarded the ship with her to her next destination, the insane asylum on Blackwell's Island. Nellie's case was particularly popular in the area, and a number of reporters had come to lay eyes on her and hopefully interview her. Even the nurses the night before wanted to try and sneak in her room to get a peek of whoever this crazy Cuban woman was. I do feel like the judge was really the ringleader in this, trying to get her story out there to the public, to get whoever her people were to come and claim her before her fate was sealed. He didn't want her to be seen as insane and shipped off to an asylum for good. Obviously, this made her nervous though, because she's actually undercover insane and just trying to collect information for her journalism. But luckily, they didn't let reporters bother her. One of the patients Nellie had spoken to was Tilly Mayard. She was 25 years old and just off her sickbed. She had a fever and what she called nervous debility. Nellie confirmed that she did look like she had been very sick, and Tilly's friends had brought her there so that she could be treated by the hospital for her illness. Later, this woman figured out that she was in a pavilion for the insane, and she was asking the doctor, why am I here? I am just here because my friends sent me here to recover from my illness, which caused my nervous stability. The doctor literally told her that she was not going to get out anytime soon, and she pushed back and she's asking to be tested. I'm not insane. If you know anything, you know that I'm perfectly sane and I'm just sick. He literally told her, we know all that we want on that score, and just left like that without letting her explain her case. The next day, on Monday, Nellie and some of the other women were taken to Blackwell's Island by boat. Blackwell's Island is a strip of land between the boroughs of Manhattan and Queens that, in my opinion, resembles kind of like a spine. The island was home to a prison, asylum, almshouse, hospital, and several other state-run charity buildings. It is known as Welfare's Island, Blackwell's Island, and later Roosevelt Island, but is referenced as Damnation Island, which is a very fitting title and one of a book that gives great detail of the history of the island. Blackwell's Island Asylum was also known as New York City Asylum, and was actually the first lunatic asylum in New York City. After an increase of alleged mentally ill patients at Bellevue Hospital, New York City officials decided they would build an asylum and reduce the overcrowding at Bellevue. The new building was put up really quickly, and it was mostly built using the slave labor of the inmates from the current island prison. When Nellie arrived, she asked the attendant where she was, and he replied, "Blackwell's Island, an insane place where you will never get out of." So that kind of sums up how things were ran back then. When Nellie walked into the asylum, she was actually stunned with how clean and glistening it was. However, she later found out that was due to the patient's hard labor, and the reason for the pristine-looking condition is the patients were basically made into slaves and servants and had to clean the whole thing, including the nurses' rooms. Another patient that was in Bellevue was also there. Her name was Louise Schantz. Louise was a German woman whose son had dropped her off at Bellevue. Unfortunately, she did not speak English, and the doctor and nurse made jokes about it instead of actually trying to get a translator, which would have been pretty easy at the time, seeing as New York City was full of immigrants. This woman had no chance to be heard. None of them did, but especially not the immigrants. In Nellie's book, 10 Days in a Madhouse, Nellie writes, "But here a woman, taken without her own consent from the free world to an asylum, and given no chance to prove her sanity, confined most probably for life behind asylum bars, without even being told in her own language the why and wherefore. Compare this to a criminal who was given every chance to prove his innocence." When it was Nellie's turn to be examined at Blackwell's Island, it was basically the doctor and nurse flirting the whole time. And while reading about it, it's just weird and cringy. Just imagine, you're at a bar and there's this dude trying to teach a girl how to play pool. Shoot pool. It was like that. And they basically just kept talking about how she was in the newspaper, and they were trying to find the frickin' article, instead of actually trying to determine her sanity. Super cool. 10 out of 10. Easy money, doc. Once in the asylum, the staff had asked her if she could play piano, and she could. So they made her dance monkey dance for a while on this out of tune piano. And then after a while, she just kind of got tired of doing that. And so she refused to play. And they basically lost interest in her, of course. So Nellie was in. The whole shit and shebang paid off. And now her goal was to prove that she's actually sane. They were summoned to dinner. And just like Bellevue, the windows were open. It's September. Everyone is freezing. She says the patients were blue and cold, which totally cures mental health issues, right? Nellie documented that the staff heard the women like cattle to the dining hall by shouting orders and smacking them in the ears for literally no reason. The food was, well, I'll just let her describe it. A pinkish-looking stuff, which patients called tea. a piece of bread cut thick and buttered, and 5 prunes. The butter was actually spoiled rotten and could not be eaten by the patients. They were just like running wild, just like stealing off each other's plates and just obviously starving. Nellie said there was even a spider in her bread during one of the meals. A patient there told her she must force the food down, otherwise she would be sick, and with those surroundings, she would actually go crazy. After dinner, it was time to get them to take a bath. The bath was actually an ice bath, which was part of what they called hydrotherapy, which is also known as a torture they used as medical treatment to shock the crazy out of people. So basically, they forced her to strip down, completely butt naked, in front of all the other patients. She requested to leave her undergarments on, and they refused. They dumped ice cold water over her head, and again, this is freezing cold, New York, September weather. Another patient who seemed to actually have mental health issues assisted in the whole process. The patient was cleaning her. They were scrubbing her so hard that she was begging that they stop. They kept ripping at her hair, and she was literally worried that she was going to drown. So they finished this bath, and they drag her, shivering out of the tub, and she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, and she actually laughed out loud because for the first time, she looked the part. She looked freaking crazy. They repeated this process with Tilly, who remember was super freaking sick and was supposed to be in the hospital to recover from her fever. Tilly told the staff that she was still ill and her head hurt and she lost hair. She was asking them please be more gentle, to which the reply was, there isn't much fear of hurting you. Shut up or you'll get it worse. And then they threw them soaking wet into their prison, asylum clothes, which were flannel slips or, a one-piece dress that kind of slips over your head with big black labels on it. Nellie said BIH6, which stood for Blackwell's Island Hall 6. So they're labeled like cattle. She asked for a nightgown when they threw her into her room, and the nurse said they do not have any and told Nellie, you are in a public institution now, and you cannot expect to get anything. This is charity and you should be thankful for what you get. Nellie, and remember, she's not acting crazy anymore. She's just being herself now. But she says, but the city pays to keep these places up and pays the people to be kind to the unfortunates brought here. The nurse snapped back at her, well, you don't need to expect kindness here, for you won't get it. And she left Nellie all alone to be soaking wet on her bed, freezing cold. Fuck this place. She tried to sleep, but it was cold, loud. She couldn't help but to think what would happen if a fire were to break out, because they're in these rooms with either no windows or bars on the windows. And each door was locked and unlocked individually with a key, one at a time. Even the prison Sing Sing had a function where all of the doors could be unlocked at once in the event of a fire. And that's a prison. This is a place for people to get mental health and not prisoners who killed people. In the morning, she was rushed through the hall with the rest of the 45 women, and there she saw everyone was washing up. There were only 2 towels to be shared between all of them. She said she watched women with sores and eruptions all over their face and bodies use the towels, and then women without any skin problems or physical illness had to use the same towels. Next, it was time for them to get their hair brushed. A patient, 2 nurses, and only 6 combs were used. And at this time, things like syphilis, typhoid, smallpox, among other things, were an issue. But at this institution, they obviously didn't care about anything sanitary or cleanliness. Patients were able to take a bath once a week, and they shared the same soap and also the same tub and the same water until it was so grimy it had to be changed. And then repeat that until all of the women are bathed. So maybe 3 changes of water. The nurses ordered the patients to care for other patients, as well as do the cleaning, including the cleaning of their own rooms, as I mentioned earlier. At this time, there was approximately 1,600 female patients at Blackwell's Island Asylum. Finally, it was time for some great outdoors. The loony ladies were going on their first walk since being there. They dressed them up in these white gowns with some super weird white hats, And they like all were laughing at how ridiculous they looked. Nellie was sort of enjoying the humor of it all until she sees women from another ward. That ward was called the Lodge. She saw them and she saw their blank stares. They were mumbling and she could even like smell them from where she was. They were so filthy. They were considered to be the most violent patients. Those patients, or more like inmates, were doing what's called a stepping mill. A stepping mill is essentially like these long cables coming down to like a thick leather belt strapped around the woman's waist, and they have to like walk in a circle and make the mill spin, kind of like where you see horses doing that. In her book, she writes, one woman had a straitjacket, and 2 women had to drag her along. Crippled, blind, old, young, homely, and pretty, one senseless mass of humanity. No fate could be worse. Nellie also mentions how they would all look out to these beautiful lawns or garden areas, but none of them were allowed to walk on them or feel the grass. And then they finished up their walk and they went to dinner. Dinner that night was basically the same quality, like hardly any food, no salt, but this time it was a little chunk of beef, a cold potato, and 1 spoonful of soup. The beef was spoiled. Spoiler alert. Some women got physically ill while trying to eat and would be yelled at to sit down while they're trying to like excuse themselves from the table to go get sick. So that's cool, just like dry heave and barf at the dinner table. You can't leave your seat. How humane. Many of the patients had to work, whether they were sewing, making mats, cleaning, doing laundry, and those women that had to do laborious jobs still had the smallest portions to eat, even after exerting a ton of energy. I literally just can't imagine doing laundry for all the people in that institution and only getting spoiled beef, a cold potato, and a spoonful of soup and maybe some pink tea, whatever the hell that is. A doctor came and did rounds, which consisted of him walking around saying, "How do you do?" Cool. Since he was there, Nellie asked some patients why won't they complain of their conditions, and all of them said that they can't complain. If they complain, the nurses are going to punish them with beatings. If women would slouch on the hard benches or sit sideways to counteract getting stiff, they were literally yelled at to sit up straight. If they walked around, they would be told to sit still, don't move. Nellie writes, quote, "What expecting torture would produce insanity quicker than this treatment? Here's a class of women sent to be cured. I would like expert physicians who are condemning me for my action, which has proven their ability to take a perfectly sane and healthy woman and shut her up and make her sit from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. on straight back benches. Do not allow her to talk or move during these hours. Give her no reading and let her know nothing of the world or its doing. Give her bad food and harsh treatment and see how long it will take her to make her insane. 2 months would make her a mental and physical wreck." This was all noted within the first 24 hours inside the sane asylum. I've not exaggerated what I've said. I'm just relaying what was written and giving direct quotes. All of this is from her writing and from her own observations. I mean, obviously I'm throwing my own opinions in there. She didn't call anyone raggedy or batshit, but this is her. This is what she experienced and this is what she wrote. I assume that due to Nellie being a high profile patient, and then with the judge showing interest in her, that I think their intrigue in her, maybe their possible fear of exposure, if the reporters did end up seeking her out or being able to interview her, made the staff treat her a little bit nicer than other patients. Because as you hear of abuse, Nellie has not really dealt with much of this. As the abuse she hears of gets worse here on out, and hydrotherapy seems to be less of a patient's worries here, she's just been lucky this whole time so far. Reports of abuse to Nellie were, once there was a 70-something-year-old blind patient who they refused to give extra clothing to. She would yell, "Oh, what are you doing with me? I'm so cold. I'm so cold. Why can't I stay in bed or have a shawl?" The staff would just jerk her around, or again, she's blind. They would just let her blindly walk around, making fun of her for running into furniture. The nurses would sit on top of this poor old woman and run their cold hands on her face and under her dress, which is disgusting, and just laugh at her screaming. One of the patients was severely ill, and the nurses decided she would learn her lesson if she were to just faint on the floor onto her face. Even though Nellie told them, hey, she's gonna fall. And that was their response to that. Nellie complained to the doctor about all of this treatment and that this woman needed to be seen quickly. Like, she was so sick, she's fainting. So the doctor went over, which should be good, right? So the doctor went over and he decided the medicine that this patient needed was to be pinched super hard between the eyes until her face turned beet red. Nellie writes, "Insane? Yes. And I watched the insanity slowly creep over the mind that had appeared to be all right. I secretly cursed the doctors, the nurses, and all public institutions." Nellie spoke of one patient named Urena, who was roughly like early to mid 30s, so like my age. But age was a really sensitive topic for this patient and for ladies of that day. She would say that she was like 18 and she was a little odd. The nurses would tease her about her true age until she would like freak the f out and start screaming. Then once she would get to that point of screaming, they would jump on her, hit her, knock her head around, and if she didn't stop, they would start choking her, eventually dragging her off to the closet, where her screams would slowly begin to be muffled. The abuse was so bad that she had finger marks on her throat even several hours later after being let out of the closet. Nellie told some of the doctors about the elderly lady that would mumble to herself, and if she wouldn't stop, then the nurses would beat her and drag her to this closet. The poor old lady would yell, "For God's sakes, ladies, don't let them beat me." And slowly her cries would become more and more muffled, just like Urena's did. But the doctors didn't care to listen. The nurse who was most likely to instigate was named Miss Grady. She was noted to do a ton of horrible things to these women, especially the older ones. She even spit in the ears of patients who didn't do what she said. And some of the things that she would tell them to do would be to say terrible things to other nurses and patients so that they would get upset with her and even potentially hurt her. In many cases, they would hurt her. One of the patients she tried to do this to was named Matilda, but even though Matilda was called insane, she wouldn't give in to any suggestions of Nurse Grady. Instead, she would ignore her as much as possible. Beach. Louise was said to have had some delusions of her dead parents, but when I was like reading this, I'm not sure if that was the case or if she was being misunderstood, because essentially this patient prayed to die and be with her parents. But to give Nellie the benefit of the doubt, since she lived with her for about 10 days, we'll say that she had some possible delusions, but it just sounded like it was taken out of context to me. Whether the delusions were true or not, she was treated horribly, even before coming to the asylum. While at Bellevue with a fever, the doctor would not listen to what she was saying. She was not comfortable with the exam, so she told him she's done talking. I'm just done talking to you. And he pinched her so hard on her ribs and told her that she will speak to him when spoken to and know her place, basically. Well, he actually said obey him. So, yeah. What the hell kind of fever reducer is that, doc? A French woman who was noted by Nellie to be completely sane was brought to the hospital by a woman of the house. So maybe this was a manager of a women's workhouse or an almshouse, which is a home for the poor. She was brought in for a fever. She hardly spoke English and was unable to fully grasp what was going on, and instead of treating her for her illness, they shipped her off to an asylum. Her name was Josephine. Josephine said, "When I first came, I cried that I was here without hope of release. And for crying, Miss Grady and her assistants choked me until they hurt my throat, for it has been sore ever since." It's noted that a Hebrew woman, which is usually what they called Jewish women back then, so a Hebrew woman spoke very little English, but the nurses told Nellie that the woman was a sex addict, sent in by her husband due to her infidelity. The nurses would instigate her and have her do horrible things like make advances to the doctors, thus making her seem even more untreatable, and she was never going to get better. Another young woman was sent to the asylum because she had been overworked. So another one of those. She had some family issues and wasn't making enough money, so she applied to the poorhouse or almshouse, and instead they sent her to the asylum. One woman got into an argument at work with another woman and was sent to the asylum. And basically that's just how it goes. The list of patients who were wrongfully committed goes on, and their stories are just so strikingly similar. Poor, immigrant, the beatings, mental instigation, and gaslighting by staff. It's just a complete pattern with Bellevue and Blackwell's Island, and if they talked about it, they would get beat more. Nurses were lying to doctors and saying women who were on the island were hurt before they got there, etc., etc. Like it wasn't them. The most descriptive abuse was a woman who thought she had seen her husband. So she thought that she saw her husband like coming up the path, and she got out of line to meet him, understandably. The nurses, instead of being like, yo, what are you doing? Get back in line, like a normal reaction, instead, they frickin' beat her with I'm just gonna quote this one. Quote, "For crying, the nurses beat me with a broom handle, jumped on me, injuring me internally, so that I shall never get over it. Then they tied my hands and feet, and throwing a sheet over my head, twisted it tightly around my neck so that I could not scream." So this is sounding a lot like what happens in the closet with the muffled screams, or the screams becoming quieter. Quote, "And thus put me in a bathtub filled with cold water. They held me under until I gave up every hope and became senseless. At other times, they took hold of my ears and beat my head on the floor and against the wall. They pulled out my hair by the roots so that it wouldn't grow again." She actually showed Nellie proof of this. She had like deformation in her head, she had bald patches, and she continued to tell Nellie, "My treatment was not as bad as I've seen others get in there, but it has ruined my health. And even if I do get out of here, I'll be a wreck." So this woman's husband actually threatened to expose them because of this treatment. So she was promised that he would be able to get her home. Another woman stated a similar story of being beaten and drowned. Women were injected with morphine and other medications that made them go crazy with dry mouth. And they would want water so bad, and they refused hydration during this period of treatment. So they'd be high on morphine, drug they've never used, and their mouth is dry, and they wouldn't be allowed water. One woman had been beaten so badly and given an ice bath, and the next morning she was found dead. They said she died from convulsions. So no accountability, again. One night when Nellie could not sleep, the nurses tried to get her to take a dose of laudanum, which is apparently opium. She refused it, and they brought a doctor in who told her to take it, and if she refused him, then he was going to put it in her with a needle instead. So basically, to spare herself from that, she drank it down, and then as soon as they left, she just barfed it up. Nellie was at the asylum for 10 days, but was transferred multiple times into different halls. One of the halls slept 7 to a room, I assume due to overcrowding. One evening, when they were in the dining hall, they heard a baby crying in the basement. A newborn baby. Nellie writes, "To think of it, a little innocent babe, born in such a chamber of horrors." Nellie and many other patients had requested to be reevaluated and to be tested for insanity, to let them have a shot to prove that they're sane. But the doctors just kept denying them. Just freaking ridiculous. I hate this place. And if anyone would complain about the abuse or conditions, the doctors just believed them to be delusional. They would just document this as delusions, and they would just shrug and laugh it off. Nellie mentions multiple times that the doctors would only make rounds to say good morning or give a how do you do before just leaving the facility. She writes, "The insane asylum on Blackwell's Island is a human rat trap. It's easy to get in, but once there, it is impossible to get out." Fortunately for Nellie, the paper she worked at had sent a lawyer, and she was released. She was able to write 3 articles about the experience and abuse that went on behind closed doors at Blackwell's, which launched an investigation and was seen before a grand jury. The women she mentioned in her reports were not really able to be found. They were said to be sick or not able to see anyone or have died or left with family. Anne did testify, but was not sworn in. And Nellie's book does not mention anything about a release, but instead another transfer. Nellie did see Tilly when she went for the investigation, the one that had the fever early on, but she was said to have been changed so much for the worse. She said, "I shuddered when I looked at her." Blackwell's Island was shut down about 7 years later, but the horrors carried on to a branch of the asylum, which was then on Ward's Island, called Manhattan State Hospital, where many patients were transferred. And that asylum I will cover in my next few videos because, yeah, it's a lot. I can't do it in this video. Nellie Bly went on to become a very well-known and even the most respected female journalist of her time. She has multiple famous works of writing, and she accomplished incredible feats in the name of journalism. such as Around the World in 72 Days, which is what she's actually most famous for. Nellie was able to travel the world and be free. Unfortunately, she was the only known person in this case to have such freedoms. Nellie died of pneumonia on January 27, 1922, unrelated to her stay at the asylum. Unfortunately, as you'll see in my next few videos, this wasn't the case for most people who were dubbed insane in New York City. Thank you for joining me on my first episode of Asylum Sundays. I really appreciate all of the support. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, turn your notifications on, share it with your grandma. I don't know. Thank you anyway. Even if you don't do any of those things, I appreciate you, and I hope you have a great day. Bye. How now, brown cow? Do I have water in my room? Oh, I got a little bit of backwash. Okay, here we go. Where's my hairstylist? Oh, beach. That's a hard no. How do people wear lipstick? I'm really bad at this. Okay.